The moment I walked into the conference room, I knew I was late to a decision that had already been made. Not late by the clock, late in the way you are when a door has been closed quietly behind your back. The room was small, no windows, beige walls that had seen too many conversations end badly. A long table sat in the center, too clean, too bare, except for one thing: a stack of documents placed neatly in front of the chair they'd left for me. A pen rested on top, angled just slightly toward my right hand, not casually, deliberately. People who want peace don't prepare signatures in advance. My brother Mark was already there, sitting dead center, jacket still on, arms folded like he was guarding something. He didn't look up when I entered. That told me more than any greeting could have. He had the posture of someone who believed the ending was guaranteed. Mom sat to his right. Linda, when she's being careful. She glanced at me once, then back to the lawyer at the end of the table. They'd been talking. She stopped the second I walked in, like someone had flipped a switch. The lawyer didn't introduce himself. He just slid a folder closer to my seat. No coffee. No, how are you holding up? No mention of Dad. Only paper. Mom cleared her throat and said, "Let's just get through this calmly." She always said that when she expected someone else to give something up. I sat down slowly. The chair was cold, the kind of cold you feel through your clothes. I noticed the empty seat across from me, pulled back slightly, as if daring me to fill it. As if this were theater, and I'd arrived just in time to play my part. "I think this will be straightforward," the lawyer said, finally looking up. Straightforward was his word for inevitable. I work in compliance, remote, tech sector, contracts, audits, risk mitigation. I know what prepared paperwork looks like. I know the difference between discussion documents and execution documents. And these, every page tabbed, highlighted, flagged, were not meant for conversation. They were meant for consent. Mark finally laughed. Not loud, not cruel, just enough to show confidence. "This won't take long," he said, leaning back. "You get nothing." The words landed cleanly, practiced. I didn't respond. Not because I was shocked, but because something settled into place. I looked around the table, counted quietly at first, then out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. They frowned. "You're a lot of people," I said. That's when I smiled for the first time that morning. "Funny thing is," I added, resting my hands in my lap, "I only brought one person too." And for the first time since I walked in, the room stopped feeling controlled. If you want to know whose name I said next, and how this inheritance hearing became the most expensive mistake my brother ever laughed through, keep listening. I wasn't always someone who counted people in a room or noticed where the pens were placed. For most of my life, I was just my father's kid. Dad, David, believed in preparation the way some people believe in luck. He didn't talk about it like wisdom. He treated it like hygiene, something you did quietly, every day, so nothing got infected later. The first time he showed me how to read a contract, I was 16. We were sitting at the small kitchen table in his condo, the one with a wobble in the third leg that he never bothered to fix. He slid a cell phone plan agreement toward me and said, "Don't look at the price first. Look at the penalties." Then he waited. He always waited. Silence was how he checked if you were thinking. He taught me to scan for clauses, to circle vague language, to ask why something needed to be rushed. When I asked why he was so careful, he didn't give me a speech. He just said, "Strangers can hurt you once. Family gets more chances." He said that calmly, like a weather report. Mark never sat at that table. After the divorce, he stayed with Mom. Linda believed in smoothing things over, in excusing behavior because of stress, or intent, or love, especially Mark's. If he missed a payment, it was because someone else had pushed him too hard. If he lied, it was because he felt cornered. Accountability was something that happened to other people. Mark borrowed money from Dad the way some people borrow tools, assuming it would always be there. 5,000 once, 10,000 another time, always with a reason. A business opportunity, a short-term gap, something that would work itself out. Dad wrote checks. Mark didn't write them back. Linda used to laugh when Dad mentioned repayment. Why keep score, she'd say. It's all family money anyway. She said it the same way she talked about groceries or utilities, like ownership was shared simply because history was. After the divorce, Dad stopped correcting her. He didn't argue. He separated. Separate accounts. Separate credit cards. Separate passwords. He showed me how to do it one evening without explaining why. Just said, "You'll need this someday." I was the only one who knew he had a lawyer. Not because he was hiding it, but because no one else asked questions that required honest answers. He told me her name, Susan, once, while we were driving back from Costco, the trunk full of paper towels and generic cereal. He said it casually, like it didn't matter. Then he added, "If anything ever feels rushed, you call her before you call me." Mark believed things would balance out. He said it often. In the end, it'll be even. Like life kept books the way Mom did, loosely, emotionally, forgivingly. He believed fairness meant equal results, not equal responsibility. The last time Mark asked Dad for money, it wasn't small. It was enough to change the room when he said the number. Dad didn't respond right away. He nodded, thanked him for being honest, and said he'd think about it. That was when Dad started updating paperwork. Quietly, methodically. Not out of anger, out of pattern recognition. I didn't know all of this then, not fully. I just knew that things had weight before they ever fell, that people practiced their roles long before they stepped onto the stage. Sitting in that conference room now, with my brother so sure of the ending, I could see it clearly. This wasn't sudden. It wasn't emotional. It had been rehearsed for years. My father died on a Tuesday night. There was no warning, no long illness, no time to organize words into something meaningful. A truck drifted across lanes on the freeway, and that was enough. By the time my phone rang, the story had already ended. I remember the sound of the nurse's voice more than what she said. Steady, professional, like she'd delivered this information before and would do it again before her shift was over. She asked if I was driving. She asked if I had someone with me. She did not ask if I was ready. By the time I reached the hospital, Mom was already there. Linda stood near the nurse's station, arms folded, speaking in a low voice to someone I didn't recognize. She looked composed, alert, like a person who had arrived early to handle logistics. She turned when she saw me, her face rearranging itself into grief, and reached out as if we were meeting at a funeral instead of a trauma ward. Mark was pacing. He stopped when a doctor approached and asked, "Is there anything we need to sign?" The doctor blinked, glanced at the chart, and said no. That question stayed with me. Dad's room was quiet. Too quiet. Machines unplugged, sheets smoothed. I stood there longer than I needed to, touching his jacket draped over the chair, trying to locate the moment when preparation stops mattering. I didn't find it. The funeral was small. That was what he wanted. No speeches, no slideshow, a few coworkers, a couple of neighbors. Folding chairs arranged too close together. Linda cried the loudest. Her voice carried. People turned when she sobbed, when she gripped Mark's arm and said, "I don't know how we're supposed to survive this." She said it to anyone who would listen. I stood near the back, hands clasped, watching the room. She told a woman from Dad's office, "He left us nothing." She told a distant cousin, "It's just me and my son now." She did not mention my name. After the service, before the chairs were even stacked, Mark went to Dad's condo. I know this because a neighbor called me later, confused, asking if it was okay that someone was inside. Mark had keys. He always had. He went through drawers, file cabinets, the safe Dad used for passports and insurance papers. He took photos of documents he didn't recognize. He searched for something specific and didn't find it. No will. That's when the tone shifted. Calls turned sharp. Messages grew urgent. Linda asked if Dad had ever mentioned paperwork. Mark asked if I'd seen anything in his office. When I said no, they stopped asking questions and started making statements. This needs to be fair. We'll figure it out. It'll all come out the same. 2 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the line introduced herself as Susan Miller. She said she was my father's attorney. She said he'd asked her to contact me directly if anything happened. She didn't ask how I was holding up. She asked where I was and if I could talk privately. We met in her office, not at the courthouse, not at home. Neutral ground. She slid a folder across the desk and waited until I opened it. Inside was my father's will. Updated, signed, witnessed. Clear. She explained it calmly. There would be a private reading. No audience, no discussion. That was his instruction. When I asked why he hadn't told anyone else, she didn't hesitate. He anticipated pressure, she said, and he wanted you insulated from it. I didn't feel relief. I felt something colder, like standing at the edge of something that hadn't fallen yet. Driving home, I realized the grief everyone else was performing hadn't even reached its sharpest point. The tragedy wasn't over. It was just getting organized. The messages started 2 days after I met with Susan. They didn't come all at once. They came spaced out, like someone testing pressure points. Mom texted first. "Are you really going to let your brother end up on the street?" There was no greeting, no question mark that invited an answer, just an accusation shaped like concern. Mark called that night. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that sounded practiced, like he'd set it into a mirror first. "Do you even have a heart?" he asked. "Because this doesn't feel like something a sister would do." They never mentioned the will directly, not at first. They talked around it, about responsibility, about family, about how hard things were right now. Linda told me Mark was drowning in debt, that interest rates had gone up, that opportunities had fallen through. She didn't mention the new SUV parked in her driveway or the vacation photos she'd posted from Palm Springs the month before. When I didn't respond, the tone shifted. Linda said I was tearing the family apart, that Dad would be ashamed, that grief was making me selfish. She wrote long messages late at night, paragraphs without breaks, full of phrases like, "This isn't who you are, and I raised you better than this." She framed it like disappointment, which was more effective than anger. They repeated the same sentence over and over, as if saying it enough times would make it true. "Your father wouldn't want this." They said it like they knew him better than I did. Like the years I spent sitting across from him at that small kitchen table didn't count. Like preparation was something he'd only practiced until it became inconvenient for them. The first time I mentioned Susan, the air changed. I didn't say her name with emphasis. I just said I'd spoken to Dad's attorney and that everything needed to go through her. Linda replied within seconds. "Why are you lawyering up?" she asked. "Are you planning to sue your own family?" Mark followed with a different angle. "Lawyers cost money," he said. "Do you really want to waste Dad's legacy on that?" It was subtle. The implication that protecting myself was somehow an attack. A day later, Linda suggested that if we couldn't handle this privately, things might get messy. She mentioned court filings, public records, how people talk. She reminded me that family friends still asked about me, that stories travel. Mark was more direct. He said if I forced this, people would see me differently, that cousins would take sides, that I'd be known as the one who chose money over blood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. They started using words like greedy and ungrateful, not angrily, casually, as if they were stating facts, as if those labels had always been waiting for me, and they were just finally saying them out loud. None of it was about logic. None of it addressed the document sitting in Susan's office with my father's signature at the bottom. This wasn't an argument to be won. It was an atmosphere to be created. The goal wasn't to convince me. It was to make me uncomfortable enough to stop resisting, to make silence feel rude, to make boundaries feel cruel, to make compliance feel like kindness. I didn't argue back. I didn't defend myself. I saved every message, every voicemail, dates, times, exact wording. My father used to say that when people feel entitled, they stop being careful. What struck me most wasn't the anger. It was how quickly grief turned into strategy. They weren't asking what Dad wanted anymore. They were telling me what kind of person I would be if I didn't give them what they wanted, and they expected shame to do the rest. I didn't reply to any of it. Not the accusations, not the guilt, not the late-night paragraphs that arrived like confessions and read like threats. I let the messages sit exactly where they landed. Instead, I started saving things. Every voicemail, every text, screenshots with timestamps intact. I labeled folders by date, not emotion. My father had taught me that when situations turn adversarial, clarity matters more than tone. I wasn't collecting ammunition. I was collecting a record. Susan called it documentation. I thought of it as keeping the lights on. When we met again, she asked me to bring everything. She read without reacting. No nodding, no commentary. Just page after page, like she was assembling something in her head. Then she pointed to a paragraph in the will I hadn't noticed before. A no contest clause. If anyone challenged the will and lost, they forfeited whatever they were granted under it. In this case, that amount was small, symbolic, but it mattered. Susan explained it plainly. If Mark sued and failed, he'd walk away with nothing. If he won, unlikely, he could force redistribution. It was a long shot, but long shots still cost time, money, and attention. The risk wasn't legal. It was personal. That's when I understood what the pressure was really for. They weren't confident. They were hoping I'd fold before they had to expose themselves to consequences. I went home and opened my laptop. Before court, before conversations, before any more words were exchanged. I logged into every account I had. Bank, investments, credit cards. I checked access logs, locations, devices. Nothing suspicious yet, but that didn't mean it would stay that way. I changed every password. Not variations, new strings, random, long. I turned on two-factor authentication everywhere it was available. Text messages, authenticator apps, backup codes saved offline. It felt excessive until it didn't. I froze my credit, not because something had happened, because something might. That night, I built a timeline. I listed each message from Mom and Mark in order. What was said, what was implied, where the tone shifted, where legal language crept in, disguised as concern. It wasn't dramatic on paper. It was methodical, and that made it more unsettling. I printed everything: emails, texts, voicemails transcribed, call logs, bank summaries, copies of the will, probate documents. I organized them into a folder with tabs. Not to intimidate anyone, to make sure I didn't forget what had actually happened once things got loud. I didn't tell my family I had a lawyer, not because I was hiding, because disclosure would have changed the behavior. It would have forced them to recalibrate. I needed them consistent, predictable, Silence helped with that. Without resistance, they kept revealing themselves. Susan and I agreed on a plan. I would attend the inheritance hearing alone. I would listen. I would say as little as possible. She would be available, nearby, ready. There was no speech prepared, no dramatic reveal, no moment rehearsed, just readiness. The night before the hearing, I slept without alarms. I packed the folder. I laid out clothes that didn't ask for attention. I checked my phone one last time and turned it face down. I thought about my father, how he'd taught me to prepare without panic, to separate emotion from action, to treat pressure like a signal, not a command. By the time I walked into that conference room the next morning, I wasn't hoping for fairness. I was ready for whatever version of the truth they decided to show me, and that made all the difference. The clerk finished reading the asset summary without looking up. Her voice was even, practiced. Condo, accounts, insurance, investment balances. She paused once to turn a page, then continued, as if none of it belonged to anyone sitting in the room. When she reached the end, she folded her hands and waited. For a second, no one spoke. Then Mark laughed. Not a chuckle, not a breathy release of tension. A full laugh. Loud. Sudden. The kind that snaps heads up without warning. It echoed off the walls, too big for the room, too comfortable. "You get nothing," he said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words were clean, exact. He'd been holding them for a while. Mom nodded beside him. Once. Slow. Like she was confirming something already decided. She didn't look at the clerk or the paperwork. She looked at me. The way people look at someone after a game has ended. Their lawyer leaned forward and slid the documents across the table. The paper stopped just short of my hands. The pen followed. Close enough that I could feel the weight of it without touching it. I noticed the logo at the top of the page, the formatting, the margin spacing. Everything was in order. Everything had been prepared for this moment. Mark leaned back in his chair, then forward again, lowered his voice. "Just sign," he said. "Let's not drag this out." No one interrupted him. The room went still. Not awkwardly, expectantly, like a pause written into a script. This was the part where I was supposed to cry, or argue, or explain myself. Where someone would offer me a tissue. Where things would get emotional enough to blur the edges of what was being asked. I could feel it, the waiting. Not concern, not sympathy, anticipation. I looked at the pen. It was close enough to brush my fingers if I shifted even slightly. Close enough to feel like an invitation. Or a dare. I didn't move. I didn't look at Mark. Or at Mom. Or at the lawyer who had already started arranging the pages as if my compliance were a formality. I didn't ask questions. I didn't clarify terms. I didn't point out contradictions. My face didn't change. That seemed to confuse them. Mark's smile held for a beat too long. Linda's eyes flicked toward the pen, then back to me. The lawyer cleared his throat just once, as if reminding me that time was passing. It wasn't. This was the moment everything they'd done had been building toward. The messages, the pressure, the silence, the performance of grief. All of it narrowed into this narrow strip of table between my hands and that pen. I counted. Not out loud. Just enough to slow my breathing. Enough to stay where I was. When I finally looked up, it wasn't dramatic. I didn't straighten. I didn't lean forward. I just met their eyes one at a time, like I was checking attendance. There was no anger in the room. No shouting, no chaos. Just certainty. On their side. And something else on mine. This was the moment that would define everything that came after. Not because of what I was about to say, but because of what I didn't do. I didn't reach for the pen. And for the first time since the hearing began, the silence stopped feeling controlled. It felt fragile, like something that could break. I smiled. Not the kind that asks to be noticed, not the kind that explains itself, just enough to register, just enough to signal that something had shifted. I didn't look at Mark. I didn't look at Mom. I didn't look at the pen. I said one word. Susan. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It landed the way names do when they already belong in a room. There was a pause. Not confusion, recognition. The lawyer on their side stiffened slightly, like he'd just realized a door he assumed was locked had been left open. The door behind me opened. Susan stepped in without urgency. Navy blazer, flat shoes, a slim folder tucked under her arm. She didn't scan the room. She didn't take inventory of faces. She walked to the table and set the folder down in front of her seat, aligning it with the edge like everything else in this room had been aligned. She didn't look at anyone. "This will is valid," she said. Slow, clear, declarative. Not an argument, not a warning. A statement of record. She opened the folder and slid a copy of the will forward, placing it between herself and the clerk. Then another document. Then another. Probate confirmation. Witness affidavits. Filing dates. Each page landed softly, but with purpose. She spoke again, still not raising her voice. The decedent executed this will after the divorce. It meets all statutory requirements. There is no ambiguity regarding intent. She paused, not for effect, to let the sentence finish doing its work. And it includes a no contest clause. That word changed the room. Mark's color drained in stages. Not instantly, like blood retreating. His posture shifted forward, then back, like he wasn't sure which position still worked. His mouth opened once, then closed. He looked at the papers for the first time since the hearing began. Mom didn't nod this time. She didn't speak either. Susan continued, still addressing no one in particular. Any party who challenges this will and fails forfeits their interest entirely. She turned a page. That forfeiture has already been documented. Silence followed. Not the curated kind from before. This one wasn't controlled. It spread unevenly. The clerk looked down. The opposing lawyer adjusted his glasses, then stopped adjusting them. Mark stared at me. That was the first time he'd really looked since I arrived. It wasn't anger. It was calculation. Running out of room. He tried to smile again and failed. His jaw tightened, then loosened, like he was swallowing something he didn't expect to taste. Mom's hands were folded in front of her, perfectly still. She didn't reach for the papers. She didn't look at Susan. She stared at the table as if it might give her another version of events if she waited long enough. It didn't. Susan closed the folder. "We're done here," she said. "Unless there are grounds to proceed." No one offered any. The pen stayed where it was. For the first time since I'd walked into that room, no one was waiting for me to do anything. I didn't stand. I didn't speak. I just sat there, hands folded in my lap, watching something unravel without noise. This was the moment. Not the laugh, not the insult. This. The moment when certainty collapsed under its own weight and everyone in the room realized the ending they'd rehearsed no longer applied. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't defended myself. I just said a name. And that was enough. After the hearing, my phone stayed quiet for 3 hours. That alone felt wrong. Mark usually called immediately when things didn't go his way. He liked to reframe, to negotiate, to find an angle he hadn't tried yet. Silence wasn't his style. It meant he was doing something else. When the calls finally came, I didn't answer. 4 missed calls in 12 minutes. No voicemail, just pressure without words. That night, an email landed in my inbox with my bank's logo at the top and a subject line that read, "Unusual activity detected. Action required." It looked right. Font, colors, language, the kind of message you don't question when you're tired and already on edge. I hovered over the link. Something felt off. Not enough to alarm me, just enough to slow me down. I checked the sender address, then the URL. It was close. One extra letter. One subtle change you'd miss if you were rushing. I didn't click. I copied the link and ran it through a checker. It led to a page designed to harvest credentials. Clean, professional, not amateur work. I opened my bank's security logs. There it was, a failed login attempt from an unfamiliar device. Location services placed it within a mile of my mother's house. Timestamp, 23 minutes before the email hit my inbox. That was the moment the shape of it changed. I pulled up my Ring app. I hadn't installed the camera because I felt unsafe. I'd installed it because my father used to say preparation shouldn't wait for fear. I scrolled back through the footage from that afternoon. At 3:14 p.m., a familiar SUV idled across the street. Mark sat in the driver's seat, laptop open on his knees. The screen glow lit his face. He wasn't typing much, mostly watching. At 3:16 p.m., motion registered near my mailbox. Linda stood there with her phone pressed to her ear. She glanced up and down the street, then toward Mark's car. She didn't take any mail. She just stood, waiting. At 3:18 p.m., my bank log recorded another failed login attempt. Same device, same location. The timestamps lined up with a precision that made my chest feel hollow. I watched the footage again, then again. Mark didn't look rushed. Linda didn't look nervous. They moved like people who believed they were still entitled to the outcome, even if the process had changed. I exported the clips, downloaded the logs, saved everything twice. Then I called Susan. She didn't ask me how I felt. She asked me to send everything. 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time it was her. "This isn't pressure anymore," she said. "This is attempted identity theft." She told me to stop engaging completely. No responses, no warnings, no confrontations. She explained next steps the way my father used to explain emergency procedures, clearly, without panic, assuming I could follow directions. I filed a report with the bank's fraud department, then another with local law enforcement, then an IC3 complaint. Each form asked the same questions in slightly different ways: dates, times, evidence. The repetition didn't make it emotional. It made it real. By midnight, the story had shifted categories. This was no longer about inheritance, or grief, or family dynamics. It was about access, about intent, about people who believed proximity gave them permission. I sat at my kitchen table with the laptop open, the same table where my father once taught me to read contracts. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, everything was documented. What struck me most wasn't the betrayal. It was the efficiency. They hadn't lashed out. They hadn't exploded. They'd simply moved from asking to taking, as if the only mistake they'd made was underestimating how carefully I'd been paying attention. By morning, this wouldn't be a private matter anymore. It would be a record. And records don't care who raised you. Courtrooms don't look the way they do on television. There's no music, no dramatic lighting, just hard benches, pale walls, and a sense that the room has absorbed too many versions of the same story to be impressed by any of them. I sat at the table beside Susan with my hands folded around a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Across the aisle, Mark and Linda sat with their attorney. Mark stared at the table. Linda dabbed her eyes before anything had even started. The judge didn't ask for feelings. He asked for exhibits. The first video played without commentary. My front door camera. Date and time stamped in the corner. Mark's SUV idling at the curb. Laptop open, screen glow on his face. The video ended without sound. Then the next clip. Linda at the mailbox, phone to her ear, looking around, waiting. No one spoke. The prosecutor moved on. Bank access logs appeared on the screen. IP addresses, device IDs, timestamps, failed login attempts highlighted in yellow. The judge leaned forward slightly, the way people do when something confirms what they already suspected. Then the voicemail played. Mark's voice filled the room, calm, familiar, edged just enough to register as pressure. He talked about consequences, about how things could get complicated, about how I didn't want to make this harder than it had to be. The words sounded smaller in court, stripped of context, reduced to intent. Their attorney stood to respond. He tried. He suggested misunderstandings, emotional timing, grief-driven behavior. He said families make mistakes under stress. He said no money had actually been taken. The judge let him finish. Then he asked one question. Why was access attempted from a device linked to the defendant, from a location associated with the other defendant, immediately before a phishing email was sent to the victim? The attorney paused. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at his notes. He did not answer. Mark's shoulders dropped, just slightly, like something inside him had finally stopped holding. Linda cried then, not quietly, not performatively, just enough to be noticed. No one handed her a tissue. The bailiff stared straight ahead. The judge didn't look at her. He looked at the screen. The ruling came without drama. Attempted fraud, coordinated access, intent established through pattern and timing. He spoke as if he were reading weather conditions. Fines were imposed. Numbers large enough to matter, but not theatrical. Restitution ordered. Legal costs accounted for. Then probation. Terms outlined. Financial monitoring. Restrictions. The language was precise, unforgiving in its clarity. Finally, the restraining order. No contact, direct or indirect. No proximity to my home. No interference with any account associated with my name. 5 years. The judge paused before closing the file. He said something about trust, about how familiarity can be used as a tool, about how the law doesn't recognize family exceptions when intent is clear. Then he was done. The room emptied quietly. Mark stood last. He didn't look at me. Linda lingered for a moment, eyes red, scanning for something that wasn't there. Sympathy, perhaps, or a crack in the outcome she could still slip through. There wasn't one. Outside, the hallway smelled like disinfectant and paper. People passed by carrying their own problems, their own folders, their own versions of inevitability. Susan walked with me to the exit. She didn't congratulate me. She just said, "This is over." I nodded. The family they'd presented to the world, the photos, the captions, the story, collapsed without noise. No announcement, no confrontation, just absence. And for the first time since my father died, I understood something clearly. Justice doesn't need emotion. It doesn't need volume. It only needs a record that tells the truth, even when the truth is inconvenient to the people who expected loyalty to be automatic. The door closed behind me, and nothing followed. I kept the assets my father left me. Not because I fought harder, not because I outplayed anyone, because they were mine to keep. There was no victory lap, no announcement, no moment where I felt justified enough to explain myself to anyone who hadn't asked. I didn't post. I didn't correct rumors. I didn't tell my side of the story to relatives who suddenly remembered my number. I let the silence do what it does best. I cut contact completely. Blocked numbers, filtered emails, returned one letter unopened. The restraining order made it official, but I would have done it anyway. Some distances aren't emotional, they're structural. Life got quieter after that. Not better in any dramatic sense, just quieter. Mornings without dread. Evenings without rehearsing conversations that never happened. I stopped checking my phone every time it buzzed, expecting another demand dressed up as concern. The quiet felt strange at first, like a room after furniture has been removed. Empty, but finally usable. I went back to work. Same desk, same screens, same tasks. I started cooking again instead of ordering in. I slept through the night without waking to phantom notifications. When my phone rang, it was usually someone who wanted something simple. A meeting, a confirmation, nothing loaded. Sometimes I thought about my father, about the way he prepared without explanation, the way he never said, "This is for when things go wrong." He just did the work and trusted that I would recognize it when I needed to. I remembered something he said once, years ago, when I asked why he kept copies of everything. "Because memory gets edited," he said. "Paper doesn't." At the time, I thought he meant accountants. Now I knew he meant people. I understood why he separated accounts, why he chose his words carefully, why he told me the name of his lawyer once and never brought it up again. He wasn't expecting betrayal. He was accounting for probability. One name had changed everything, not because it was powerful, but because it was placed there deliberately, long before anyone thought it would be needed. Susan hadn't saved me. The law hadn't saved me. Preparation had. Family, I learned, isn't the place where you surrender your future to keep the peace. It's the place where your future is supposed to be protected, even when that protection is inconvenient. I stopped thinking about what they lost. I thought instead about what I didn't. I didn't lose my name. I didn't lose control. I didn't lose the version of myself my father had quietly prepared me to be. The condo felt different after everything settled. Not heavier, lighter, like it finally belonged to me, not just legally, but structurally. I rearranged furniture, threw out old paperwork, replaced a chair that had always wobbled. Small, ordinary things. There was no closure conversation, no apology waiting to be accepted or refused, just an ending that arrived without ceremony. Sometimes people ask if it was worth it, if the money was worth losing family. I never know how to answer that, because I didn't lose family. I lost a claim, and I kept something else instead. When I think back to that room, the pen, the silence, the certainty they carried, I don't feel anger anymore. I feel clarity. I didn't win. I was protected.